Few people outside the organization know this, but during the 1980s and early 1990s, the Awake magazine, distributed worldwide by Jehovah's Witnesses, repeatedly claimed that young people of the 1980s would not grow old before the end of the present system of things. This line was printed in dozens of issues up until 1995. For millions who had already been taught that the last days began in 1914, this wasn't just a comforting thought, it was a countdown. As the year 2000 approached, many quietly believed that Armageddon was near, even if no date had been officially announced. The teaching of the generation of 1914 added even more fuel to the fire. According to the Watchtower, the generation that witnessed the events of 1914 would still be alive to see the end. But by the year 2000, that generation would be well into their 80s or 90s. For thousands of witnesses, the conclusion was clear. The world would end around the turn of the millennium. It didn't need to be said outright. The tone of the publications, the urgency in the talks, and the consistent warnings all painted the same picture. Many believers made life-altering decisions because of it. Putting off marriage, skipping college, avoiding children, all because they truly believed this system wouldn't survive past the year 2000. But when the clock struck midnight and the new millennium arrived, nothing happened. The world kept turning. The system didn't collapse. And the Watchtower? It fell silent. No apologies. No doctrinal correction. No acknowledgement of the expectations they helped create. Just a quiet shift in messaging, as if nothing had been implied. In this video, we'll examine the publications, the testimonies, and the shattered hopes of a generation that waited for something that never came. And we'll ask the hard question: when false expectations are planted and then ignored, who pays the price? Before we dive into this untold chapter of Watchtower history, make sure to subscribe to the channel and leave a like. It helps us reach more people who are questioning, healing, and searching for the truth behind the doctrine. If this topic matters to you, help amplify the message. The year 2000 didn't come out of nowhere for Jehovah's Witnesses. It was the product of a long chain of dates, teachings, and failed expectations, all embedded deep within Watchtower literature. It began with 1874, then 1914, then 1925, then 1975. And each time, the organization either hinted or directly stated that the end was near. And when nothing happened, instead of issuing clear apologies, the Watchtower simply reinterpreted or redirected attention. By the 1980s and 1990s, members had learned to read between the lines, and many began looking at the year 2000 with quiet anticipation. One major doctrine that set the stage was the teaching of the generation of 1914. According to the Watchtower, the generation that witnessed the events of 1914, such as World War I, would still be alive when the end of the system came. This teaching was drilled into members for decades. But by the 1990s, time was running out. If someone was 10 years old in 1914, they'd be 96 in the year 2000. The math was simple. Many witnesses concluded, silently, but firmly, that the end had to come around the turn of the millennium. This idea was reinforced not only through doctrine, but through tone, the tone of urgency. Phrases like, "We are living in the final part of the last days," were common in public talks. Watchtower publications used phrases like, "We are minutes to midnight on God's prophetic clock." To many, it was clear, 2000 wasn't just a date. It was a potential deadline. A silent countdown embedded in decades of theology and reinforced by repetition. The organization never printed the words, "Armageddon will come in 2000." They didn't need to. The weight of previous failed dates, combined with an aging 1914 generation and the millennial fever that swept the world, created a perfect storm of quiet expectation. In kingdom halls around the world, many witnesses wondered, could this finally be it? If you were a Jehovah's Witness in the 1980s or 90s, you didn't need a prophecy to feel the urgency. The publications were doing the heavy lifting. One of the clearest examples comes from Awake magazine. For years, nearly every issue included this sentence. This magazine builds confidence in the creator's promise of a peaceful and secure new world before the generation that saw the events of 1914 passes away. This sentence, or versions of it, appeared consistently until 1995. That year marked a quiet but significant change. The Watchtower abruptly removed this generational claim from the magazine, without announcing the revision. Why? Because the generation of 1914 was dying out, and with it, the credibility of the timeline. But for over a decade, this message had already taken root in the minds of millions. Many believed the organization was subtly pointing to the end arriving before the year 2000. In addition, Watchtower publications often used phrases that reinforced a sense of time running out. Articles referred to the final moments of this system, the nearness of Jehovah's day, and the short time remaining. A 1989 Watchtower article even warned young people not to plan long-term careers because the end is much closer than you think. These weren't fringe ideas. They were mainstream teachings published and distributed to millions in over 100 languages. This steady drumbeat of urgency shaped how witnesses lived their lives. It didn't need to say 2000 directly, because the message was clear through repetition, tone, and doctrine. Don't plan too far ahead. And so, as the millennium approached, a quiet anticipation grew, not from one dramatic announcement, but from years of subtle reinforcement. When publications send the same message month after month, year after year, people start to believe it. While the organization never officially stated that the year 2000 would mark the end, the atmosphere within the congregations told a different story. For many Jehovah's Witnesses, the tension was unspoken, but deeply felt. They whispered about it after meetings. Elders hinted at it in their talks. Pioneers and Bethel workers made subtle references. It was a shared understanding, a kind of spiritual code. We probably won't be here much longer. This mindset had very real consequences. Young people were discouraged from pursuing higher education or long-term careers. Couples put off having children. Others rushed into marriage, thinking they didn't have time to wait. Some left stable jobs to pioneer full-time, believing the window of opportunity to serve Jehovah before the end was closing fast. One former witness described it this way: "We didn't say it out loud, but everyone thought it. The year 2000 meant something. We were sure of it, just not allowed to say it from the platform." Even children absorbed the fear. Many recall being terrified of not surviving Armageddon, or waking up in the middle of the night believing the world was about to end. It wasn't just about doctrine, it was psychological conditioning. Everything, from the illustrations in the magazines to the language used in meetings, pointed toward an imminent global catastrophe. And as the world became obsessed with Y2K panic, many witnesses saw it as confirmation, a worldly echo of divine timing. But when nothing happened, there was no address from the governing body. No explanation. No reflection. Just a quiet pivot, as if nothing had ever been expected. Those who had silently built their hopes and fears around the year 2000 were left to cope on their own, often in silence. And the organization? It moved forward, as if the collective anticipation had never existed. When the clock struck midnight on January 1, 2000, the world celebrated. Fireworks exploded across cities. The dreaded Y2K bug fizzled into nothing. Life continued. But for many Jehovah's Witnesses, that night brought something else, a deep, quiet disappointment. After years of subtle suggestions and emotional investment, the world didn't end. The generation of 1914 was fading away. The long-promised end of this system never came. And yet, the Watchtower said nothing. There was no special edition of the Watchtower explaining why the end hadn't come. No broadcast from the governing body acknowledging the emotional toll of decades of urgency. No apology. Instead, the messaging shifted, slowly, carefully. The teaching on the generation was reinterpreted to mean overlapping generations. The focus turned to abstract terms like Jehovah's timetable and waiting on Jehovah. Without ever admitting fault, the organization simply moved the goalposts again. For many long-time members, this quiet shift was a breaking point. Some began to question whether the organization had truly been led by divine insight, or if it had simply been recycling failed expectations under new labels. Others fell into depression, realizing they had structured their entire adult lives around a promise that never materialized. Stories emerged of individuals who had given up careers, relationships, or financial stability, all for a deadline that dissolved into silence. And still, no one took responsibility. Instead of introspection, the Watchtower doubled down on loyalty. Questioning the leadership was equated with rebellion. Expressing doubt became dangerous. And those who quietly left were dismissed as having lost faith, when in reality, many had simply lost patience with a system that refused to acknowledge its own history. In the wake of the millennium, the silence was deafening, and for many, it was all the confirmation they needed. For many Jehovah's Witnesses, the disappointment of the year 2000 didn't just fade with time, it left lasting psychological scars. When you've been taught for decades that the world is about to end, and that your every life decision must align with that urgency, the aftermath of a failed expectation can feel like spiritual whiplash. The organization may have stayed silent, but for many individuals, the emotional toll was impossible to ignore. Some former witnesses describe a deep sense of betrayal, not just by the leaders, but by themselves. They had trusted the guidance. They had shaped their entire lives around it. When the promised end didn't come, many were left asking, "Did I waste my life?" That question haunts people who never went to college, never had children, never took a chance at a different path, all because they believed the end was too close to risk it. For some, this realization didn't just cause disappointment, it triggered full-blown identity crises, depression, and anxiety. Others experienced religious trauma, a term used to describe the emotional damage caused by authoritarian religious systems. The constant pressure to obey, to sacrifice, to prove loyalty, all under the threat of Armageddon, left many with long-term guilt, fear, and difficulty trusting any form of authority. Some found it nearly impossible to pray again or open a Bible without triggering painful memories of manipulation and fear. The trauma wasn't just theological, it was deeply personal. Yet through that pain, something else began to grow: awareness. As ex-members began connecting online and sharing their stories, they discovered a common thread. They were not alone. Their doubts were not unique. Their disappointments were not isolated. What had once felt like a private shame was actually part of a much larger pattern, one that the organization refuses to confront to this day. And that silence continues to speak volumes. The story of the year 2000 within Jehovah's Witnesses is not just about a date, it's about a pattern. A cycle of building expectations, emotional investment, silent disappointment, and doctrinal shifts. It happened in 1914, then in 1925, then again in 1975, and quietly, in the shadow of the millennium, it happened once more. Yet each time, those responsible never take responsibility. The burden falls, not on the leaders, but on the people, the ones who trusted, sacrificed, and waited. And maybe that's the most dangerous part of it all, not the false expectations, but the refusal to acknowledge them. When leaders speak vaguely but with authority, when they imply but never commit, when they stir hope but leave no accountability, what are they really doing? Are they leading people to truth? Or simply managing disappointment through silence? To those still inside the organization, we're not here to attack your faith. We're here to ask honest questions, the kind that deserve honest answers. Why did so many expect the end by 2000? Why were those hopes never addressed? And if this pattern has repeated for over a century, how many more times will it have to fail before it's okay to ask why? Have you or someone you know experienced this silent expectation around the year 2000? Were you told to delay life decisions, only to be left in confusion when nothing happened? Share your story in the comments. Your voice matters, and someone else out there needs to hear that they're not alone.